Good morning. Good morning to all of you here in this warm place. It's a good thing that we're meeting at 9:30. And good morning to those of you that are on Zoom. If we could include our Zoom audience, glad you are here. I am Kathleen Brannan. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome to all, whether here in person or on Zoom. On this day, as with so many Sundays, we come in from the whirling world. The wind, the bright sun, the push and pull of tides and time, from the tumult of global news and local stories, the pain we hear of, the demands on our spirits, the do this now culture that we live in. We come into this sanctuary from that windstorm, the rush of speeding drivers on the roadways, the rustling silence that fills some of our homes, the vastness of a once busy and perhaps now quieter house. All of this can leave us feeling stirred and unsettled. When we give our attention to what's going on around and beyond us in this throbbing world, we can feel windblown. We need places where we can come and find our grounding once again. Come in from the wind, come in from the whirl. May this be a place where we can experience genuine stillness, even just for a few moments. May this be a place that we can count on here on these ancient lands of the Utes and 47 other indigenous tribes. Or as we turn on our computers and come seeking our congregational homepage. May we feel pulled into a restorative time of energetic peace, a time of finding our true self, where violence is never the answer. May this be a place of learning, of nourishment, a community that generates new zest in us for the dynamic beauty of the world. Come, let us enter this sacred time together.
We are one, a diverse group of proudly kindred spirits, here not by coincidence, but because we choose to journey together. We are active and proactive. We care deeply. We live our love as best we can. We are one, working, eating, laughing, playing, singing, storytelling, sharing, and rejoicing, getting to know each other. Taking risks, opening up, questioning, seeking, searching, trying to understand, struggling, making mistakes, paying attention, asking questions, listening, living our answers, learning to love our neighbors, and being forgiven through grace, apologizing and forgiving with humility. Creating the beloved community together. We are one. When we give to the offering, we are giving to each other, and of course, we are grateful for each other's generosity. Instructions for giving will be on the screen and in the chat.
Our world is home to an extraordinarily beautiful variety of life. According to Sir David Attenborough, the term biodiversity describes the total variety of life on Earth. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, and billions of different individuals with trillions of different characteristics. This biodiversity is not only the most complex aspect of our planet, but also the most vital. As humans, we are not separate from biodiversity. We are part of biodiversity. Just as planet Earth requires ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity in order to maintain balance and thrive as a whole, so too do humans, as a species, require diversity, not only to survive, but to flourish. Across history, there has been a tendency for human beings to fear our differences, to equate difference with defectiveness, or even label our differences as disorders. We think that it is time for us to rethink the way we view our differences. We think that it is time for us to recognize that difference represents diversity, and this diversity is vital to our collective well-being. The more genetic diversity there is among us, the better we are able to continually adapt to our environment as it changes and evolves. Species that lack genetic diversity are far more vulnerable to being devastated by changes in the environment. This means, as a species, we do not survive despite people who are different, but rather, the differences among us are the diversity that helps humanity to flourish. There are many obvious ways in which we humans differ from one another, but perhaps less obviously, we all differ in the way our minds work. Humans think, feel, perceive, process, and experience the world in vastly different ways. This beautiful diversity of human minds, with infinite variation in traits and abilities, is known as neurodiversity. There are minds that sense the most subtle changes in the environment, minds that have a determined sense of social justice, and minds that create stories within worlds that most of us can only read about. There are minds that seek patterns to process and synthesize. There are minds that crave words or numbers or images. There are busy minds and quiet minds, highly focused minds and distractible minds. There are minds that think deeply and feel intensely. When we value neurodiversity as a form of genetic diversity, as part of the biodiversity of planet Earth, we start to value our differences and see they do not require curing, treating, or masking. We see that our differences can be accepted, appreciated, and respected.
I am grateful to the many people and places whose influences on my life have brought me here. I am grateful to the first peoples who inhabited this land, the Cheyenne, Ute, and Apache, my ancestors of spirit and body, grandmothers and grandfathers, neurodivergent and indigenous peoples trying, like all of us, to live in a good way with ourselves, each other, the world, and whatever is within and beyond it all. My name is Rae Blaisdell. My pronouns are they, them, and I am neurodivergent. This skin feels things that others don't, how others won't. Waves of heat that ripple head to toe, the texture of a thing creeping up my skin by the very slightest touch of it. I'm here because I'm passionate about this subject, and because, as a popular disability activism quote says, nothing about us without us. So I'm here to teach, share, and invite you all to follow along on my neurodivergent meanderings. The points I'll be making have something to do with a balance between grieving and wonder of it all, and an impetus to recognize our participation and reactions to diversity. Neurodiversity means diversity of neurology, and it is simply the way of things. Some of us fall far enough from the midline of the bell curve to be called neurodivergent. Anyone falling close enough to the peak of the curve is neurotypical, and there you have it. It's simple, right? Neurodivergence means all kinds of difference. Move this a little bit. Neurodivergence includes many kinds of difference. It includes the developmental types that people usually think of, like autism and ADHD. It includes learning disabilities like dyslexia and dysgraphia, medical issues like epilepsy and dysautonomia, long-term impacts of trauma and depression that change the brain, differences in neurochemistry and genetics that result in experiences like bipolar and schizophrenia, and acquired neurodivergence from events like traumatic brain injuries and strokes, just to name a few. Of course, here at a UU church, we likely know a bit about diversity and intersectionality, about divergence from well-laid paths, and some reasons for uplifting ideals related to diversity. We tend to hold values around justice, interdependence, and love. We might actively engage in work and talk about biological and cultural resilience, adaptability, reaching towards ideals beyond the legacies of colonialism, white supremacy, and Western ethnocentrism. Look at us go! I'm going to invite you to look at how you perceive and participate in these ideals of diversity. Often, we start to view the whole of neurodivergence and other diverse and intersectional experiences, and it can sometimes become difficult to draw a distinction between diversity and divergence. We start to identify our sameness more than our differences. We attune, and sometimes this is helpful, especially when we are deconstructing stereotypes and ways we have distanced others from ourselves. We do have much in common. Ola Joseph said, "Diversity is not how we differ. Diversity is about embracing one another's uniqueness." This skin can walk under a certain light and feel it as if burning, every inch of me pressed by this hot, electric, viscous light, as if the thing weren't heavy. I'm coming from personal experience as a neurodivergent person in a neurodivergent family and as a professional play therapist and marriage and family therapist who works primarily with neurodivergent people. I myself am autistic, ADHD, I have cyclothymia and dysautonomia. I also have multiracial ancestry and therefore have some intersectionality that added some resiliences as well as additional struggles and some inherent supports of difference in my childhood, while also adding confusion about how our society works. Because of this, I was not submitted to behavior modification therapies. Diversity was expressly discussed, neurodiversity was acknowledged and accommodated regularly, and the emotional attunement of my family was enough to provide a secure attachment and pretty good self-confidence for myself and my family members, regardless of ability. I was never taught that I could be anything I wanted to be, so I was not devastated when limitations arose, even if I did grieve them. My father joked that when I grew up, I was going to be an adult. He was autistic. When other children were planning their lives in kindergarten and asking me to marry them, I was insistent on being a child. I was not going to make any sort of serious decisions like marriage when I was 5. Thank you very much. I didn't have any dreams for what I wanted to be when I grew up, other than being an adult, until I was 16, when I thought it would be amazing to travel around the world. I had this image of myself as a monk in robes, like walking along to all of these spiritual centers and learning as much as I could from as many spiritual, like, wisdom traditions as I could reach. When I went to college, I didn't feel the need to get a degree, to have everything figured out. I was there to pursue my passions and my interests, and I was privileged to have a family who just thought that was a perfect reason to go to college. And also there was financial stability and all of that privilege, you know. This body too feels music. It wells up from deep within and all around, mixing and swirling and weaving. Whether I hear a song on a speaker or the wind in the trees, I need but only listen for the songs that have not yet been given voice. My passion was people, which is actually really common among autistic people, is like trying to figure people out. I was particularly interested in how minds and culture and spirituality work and develop. I wanted to know why my grandfather's pathology was so severe, while mine shared features but was not the same. I wanted to know why schools wouldn't help my brother when he needed accommodations, why my mother had to get an advocate get a student advocate, fight, and then still homeschool us because it was not enough. I wanted to know what other cultures and religions had to say about neurodivergent experiences like schizophrenia, autism, and ADHD. But I didn't trust the medical model. So I got a bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in geography, and I nearly accidentally had a second minor in philosophy. Apparently I was one class away, no idea. I started having children, and my focus moved to different cultural and spiritual practices related to children and parenting. I was a pagan and deeply drawn to earth-based religions and approaches that aligned with the philosophies and ideologies often arising in conjunction with these. So I learned about attachment theory and my family legacies of assimilation and resistance. I became a childbirth educator and labor doula, an advocate for childbirth reform. I brought my toddlers to indigenous conventions on climate activism and created locavore movements, which is like eating locally. I was really into food. I tend to drop into my interests. There's no leaning here. I just tie in, check my anchors, and over the edge I go. Which reminds me of this time I went rappelling off of the highest highway bridge in Colorado on a Thanksgiving morning, and it was really fun. Disability hit me about 10 years ago when the dysautonomia hit. I spent the next few years nearly bedbound while my marriage and my family and my health fell apart. I dove into spirituality and decided to become a depth psychotherapist while trying to figure out my health. My possible paths appeared to be either a professional career as a therapist or verifiable disability in which there was no way I was going to be able to work like that, like 2 of my siblings had already experienced. I learned I was autistic at age 37 when I had a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and the full-time workload was too much for my sensory difficulties. These difficulties were severe enough that towards the end of the workday, I would literally lose the ability to understand language. I was faced with the reality of my communication and sensory differences, and when I told my family about my diagnosis, they all came to the phone, because they all live together, most of them, because like I said, 2 disabled siblings, and they all came on the phone, and they all laughed because, not like mocking me, but they laughed because they thought I was the normal one. Turns out I was the baseline, and we are all autistic and/or ADHD. Did you know that we're always dreaming? This world of dreams from which comes meaning, music, visions, story, whether we are performing our art or sleeping in a bed or wrapped in an embrace or in the heat of our emotions, we are always dreaming. My experience isn't typical, even for the neurodivergent community. I had a fully neurodivergent family, raising the attunement significantly. Diversity awareness meant having a lot less pressure to conform to Euro-American standards, but I still grew up in this society, and when I was an adult trying to do what adults were supposed to do to support themselves and their families, I couldn't do it the same way. My brain literally shuts off. It still happens, but now I know the early signs and can do some things to take care of myself so that it doesn't happen as much. When the early signs include things like when the sounds in the room all become the same volume. The watch on my wrist, the clock on the wall, the voice in the room, and the bumps down the hall are all the same volume. I take a lot of breathing breaks, which is great modeling as a therapist, really. Individual stories are important. They build bridges of empathy, and members of similar experiences and neurotypes can find each other. When we stop at empathy, though, and it often gets ignored that many differences are less acceptable by our culture, that those differences yield significant suffering, that we experience more abuse, substance misuse, isolation, lack of care, lack of empathy, and multitudes of other intersectional challenges. When we stop with empathy, we might dismiss and ignore differences, which ironically widens the gap. This awareness endpoint that there are many divergent experiences and that we can empathize broadly leads to, ironically, over-medication of children within normal ranges of activity and focus on normal ranges of activity and focus, or the opposite, avoiding diagnosis until suffering is severe. When, more irony, people are suspected of seeking unnecessary drugs and support services. Follow me here. If we think we are the same too broadly, then we can assume our child's or our experiences are typical when they are not. And when neurodivergent children are told that they are just not trying hard enough, or they are being difficult on purpose, or that they are atypical in ways that are actually typical, such as for those whose real struggles are normal within an outrageous and unrealistic environment. My own children were denied individualized learning plans despite clear dyslexia and ADHD impacts showing in their testing, until I had procured outside testing, which I could only afford due to pre-existing professional relationships with the center that provided the testing. I was a professional, they knew me, so they provided it for free. These tests aren't covered by insurance because they're considered educational. in an educational system that doesn't want to give anybody services because they really don't have the resources. It's not just the administrative people I like to be angry at. This skin feels things that others don't, how others won't. This body, too, feels music. For some, like me, our eyes and ears and skin and breath, the instruments. We feel the resonance or dissonance of others' self, of place. Adding more to this dance of highlighting sameness and crushing differences, older children and adults who have suffered through years or decades of invisibility and shame for differences they know they have are then faced with people not believing them. A chorus of, "We're all a little autistic," or difficulty finding professionals who know how to diagnose youth and adults while navigating workplaces and schools that require professional recommendations to provide accommodations. With so many people who continue to tell them that they are just not trying hard enough. People with intersectional identities experience additional oppressions related to the teetering pattern of both diminishing and amplifying difference, often having their neurodivergent traits ascribed to stereotypes of race, sex, gender, class, etc., instead of receiving the empathy and support more available to white, middle class, and AMAB people. Although some neurodivergences result in more intersectionality, I'm particularly thinking of the autistic community, which holds higher rates of mental illness, physical disability, intellectual disability, gender and sexual diversity, and economic hardship than neurotypical segments of society. Our differences still define us, even when we are much the same. And embracing the differences is embracing diversity. We desperately need for others to stop looking only for ways we are the same or can be made to be the same. What happens when people do the opposite of ignoring differences is that we become defined by our suffering. Within much of the neurodivergent community, but especially for autistic communities, identity-first language is preferred. So I say I'm autistic, we talk about autists, we talk about ADHDers or an ADHD person. It's actually the professional worlds that tend to use person-first language. Jim Sinclair, an autism activist, said, "Autism isn't something a person has, or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of existence. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with." What we can do is move away from identifying neurodivergence only by one's suffering or only by our sameness. Identify the ways the world causes us to suffer and acknowledge our differences, but don't mourn for the ways we are different. Mourn for a society in which difference results in disorder and disease. Too many of us think we are flawed, inherently diseased, lazy, not trying hard enough, or too strange to belong. This skin feels things that others don't, how others won't. This body, too, feels music. Did you know that we're always dreaming? And some, like me, are instruments. We feel and see and smell the way the dreaming and the now is interweaving, and we know deep in our bones they are the same, and they are beautiful. I want to talk about some differences and some history. So, I've already been talking for a while, so I'm just going to move around a little bit, and you can too, that's fine. Paul Collins said, "Autists are the ultimate square pegs. And the problem with pounding a square peg into a round hole is not that the hammering is hard work, it's that you're destroying the peg." Neurotypical Euro-American models of communication follow a lot of prescriptions. I make eye contact and move towards a specific point, instead of starting with one and then jumping to another. I don't move my body too much. I don't talk too loud. I'm not too soft. I don't repeat myself. These types of communications are things I have learned, but they are not natural to me or many neurodivergent people. In fact, they are often disruptive, uncomfortable, non-consensual, dysregulating, and make our communication and understanding worse, not better. Many neurodivergent people are formally or informally forced through behavioral modification to address these problems. These types of approaches were originally developed by Hans Asperger in Vienna. Some professionals and parents highlight the improved safety that can come from these programs when addressing behaviors with children or adults who harm themselves or others, while many participants highlight the traumatic impacts from the ways these are used for so much more than harm reduction. These programs and ideologies also stem from the origins of research on autism, where the Nazi, Hans Asperger, studied and experimented on autistic children, determining which children were salvageable and which were sent to their deaths. Children like me, my siblings, and children were the autistic people who were deemed salvageable because we could hide ourselves or be taught social integration and may even have special abilities. We have long been killed, forcefully sterilized, and sent to behavioral programs. Our special interests have long been used to prove our worthiness. And we do often have special abilities. The nervous system is fascinating like that. As areas of the brain grow in use, they also grow in physical size, taking up space that must give somewhere. Other areas of the brain shrink and their associated functions reduce. This is why London cabbies have enlarged amygdalas and hold incredible navigational abilities while entirely losing other spatial capacities. There is only so much space in the brain cage. I don't have research to back me up on connecting these genetically neurodivergent brains to similarities in acquired neurodivergent brains, but it is known that autistic people tend to have what's called a spiky profile because we show various pretty big ranges in our various abilities, intelligences, and executive functions. We are not just our deficits, nor our strengths. Erasing our hardships will not result in erasing only hardships. It results in erasing us. And if the London cabbie reality is at all indicative of how neurodivergent brains work, then erasing our hardships might mean erasing our wonder, our beauty, our overwhelmingly painful and ecstatic experiences of emotion and sensation, our creativity and communications, our innovation, and the everyday joys that every one of us participated. This skin feels things that others don't, how others won't. Did you know that we're always dreaming? We are always dreaming. So when you avoid the struggles by pointing out only our sameness or our strengths, or when you grieve our struggles as if they deserve erasure from the human experience, please remember that you are pointing to a long history in which we would have been labeled as inhuman, less than, murdered, and still now erased. Our acceptance should not be dependent on assimilation, and our support needs still exist when you cannot see them. This skin feels things that others don't, how others won't. Waves of heat rippling head to toe, the texture of a thing creeping up my skin from the very slightest touch of it. This skin can walk under a certain light and feel it as if burning, every inch of me pressed by this hot, electric, viscous light, as if the thing weren't heavy. This body, too, feels music. It wells up from deep within and all around, mixing and swirling and weaving. Whether I hear a song from a speaker or the wind in the trees, I need but only listen for the songs that have not yet been given voice. Did you know that we're always dreaming? This world of dreams from which comes meaning, music, visions, story, whether we are performing our art or sleeping in a bed or wrapped in an embrace or in the heat of our emotions, we are always dreaming. And some, like me, our eyes and ears and skin and breath, the instruments. We feel the resonance or dissonance of others, self, of place. We feel and see and smell the way the dreaming and the now is interweaving, and we know deep in our bones they are the same, and they are beautiful. Just like this life within this skin can be cacophonous and lyrical, the experience of humanness can be harmonious and cynical, and I am here to tell you that we're closer than we seem. For the way to help a problem such as mine is to lean into the resonance and listen for the dream. I would not erase my dissonance in exchange for a typical life. And I ask you to face your own and all the ways you try to lean away from difference. There is a harmony there, in the relationship that acknowledges divergence and diversities. Finally, I would like to recommend some neurodivergent life lessons. Learn to recognize more than verbal communications, yours and others. Create shared meaning instead of expecting yours to apply to everyone. Show empathy with stories and movement and voice. Follow your wonder. Feel your feelings. Move, dance, make some noise. Find ways to be comfortable. Expect less work from yourself than society insists. It's okay to just be. Pre-established hierarchies are outdated. Share your wonder, your deepest interests and passions. Jump and twirl with joy. Repeat the languages of trees and cats. Join us in the world's dance. Thank you.
Together we have enjoyed the warmth and beauty of stories of this flame and of this community. As our chalice flame is extinguished this morning, we can still remember that its glow is carried within us. We can use our inner lights and this flame to kindle new sparks throughout our lives and in the world. May the spirit of peace and togetherness bless our lives. And please return at 11 for the Building and Grounds Forum today. Thank you.